Imagine it is March 14th, 2016. You are a 34-year-old primary school teacher living in Barcelona, Spain. Your name is Marta. You have rented the same apartment in the Gracia neighborhood for 6 years. It is a modest place, 2 bedrooms, terracotta tiles on the floor, a small balcony where you dry your clothes in the morning sun. You pay 650 euros a month. It is not glamorous, but it is yours in every way that matters. Your neighbors know your name. The woman at the bakery downstairs saves you the last croissant on Fridays. Your commute is 12 minutes by metro. You have built a life here, slowly, brick by brick, the way ordinary people do. You are not rich, but you are stable. And in a city like Barcelona, stability is everything. If you have ever wondered why entire neighborhoods seem to hollow out almost overnight, why longtime residents suddenly find themselves priced out of places their families lived for generations, stay with me. What you're about to hear is not a theory. It is a pattern. It has happened in Barcelona, in New Orleans, in Lisbon, in Tokyo, in Cape Town, and in dozens of cities in between. It has happened to teachers and nurses and retired couples and young families. And it always unfolds the same way. Quietly at first, then all at once. And if you find value in this kind of historical and economic clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. Now back to Marta. In the spring of 2016, Marta starts noticing something. The apartment across the hall goes quiet. The family who lived there, a couple with a teenage son, moves out. She assumes they found a bigger place. Then, a few weeks later, she sees a lockbox attached to the door handle. A small metal box where a key lives for guests. Strangers begin arriving with rolling suitcases every few days. The apartment that was someone's home is now a hotel room that doesn't advertise itself as a hotel. Then, the apartment below goes the same way. Then, the one beside it. Within 8 months, Marta is one of only 3 long-term residents left in her building. Her landlord calls her in January 2017 with news she was not prepared for. He will not be renewing her lease. He has decided to convert the entire building to short-term tourist rentals on Airbnb. This is what this video is about. How a platform built on the idea of sharing spare rooms quietly became one of the most powerful displacement engines in modern urban history. How it turned homes into hotels, neighborhoods into theme parks, and local residents into economic refugees in their own cities. This is not an argument against travel or tourism. It is an examination of what happens when a single platform connects global capital to local housing, and the local residents have no say in the outcome. Before we go further, there is something important to understand about the basic mechanism at work here. Housing markets, the systems by which rents and property prices are set, operate on something economists call supply and demand. Supply means the number of available homes. Demand means the number of people who want to live in them. When supply is low and demand is high, prices go up. Simple. What most people do not realize is that Airbnb effectively performs surgery on the supply side of that equation without anyone voting on it or even noticing until the damage is done. Think of it this way. Imagine a bathtub with a slow drain. Water is constantly flowing in. New residents, young workers, students, families. The drain keeps pace. The tub stays manageable. Now imagine someone quietly installs a second drain. Not a big one, just a small one. It pulls water out invisibly, steadily, a few liters at a time. At first, nobody notices. But over months, over years, the water level drops. The tub is emptying and nobody can figure out why, because the second drain is hidden beneath the surface. That hidden drain is short-term rental platforms pulling long-term housing units out of the residential market and into the tourism economy. The tub does not empty overnight, but it empties. The economic term for what happens next is a supply shock, which simply means a sudden reduction in available housing that prices cannot immediately adjust to. Rents spike. Longtime residents can no longer afford to stay. And a neighborhood that took decades to build, its culture, its community, its rhythms, can be dismantled in a handful of years, sometimes in a handful of months. This brings us directly to the first and perhaps most documented case of this pattern in modern history. Barcelona, Spain, between 2015 and 2019. By 2017, Barcelona had become one of the most visited cities on Earth. More than 32 million tourists passed through it every year, roughly 20 times its population. Much of that tourism was accommodation-driven, meaning millions of people were sleeping in private apartments listed on short-term rental platforms, rather than in hotels. By 2018, estimates from the Barcelona city government suggested there were more than 16,000 active Airbnb listings in the city. Researchers from the Universitat Pompeu Fabra, one of Barcelona's leading universities, published a study in 2019 examining the relationship between Airbnb density and rental prices. Their findings were stark. In neighborhoods with the highest concentration of short-term rentals, rents had increased by between 7 and 17% over a 4-year period, compared to neighborhoods with few or no listings. This does not sound catastrophic on paper, but translate it into euros and it becomes a different story. If your rent was 800 euros a month and it rose by 17%, you're now paying more than 935 euros for the same apartment. On a teacher's salary in Spain, that difference is the difference between staying and leaving. The neighborhoods hit hardest were not the wealthy ones. They were the working class and middle class ones. Barceloneta, the old fisherman's district closest to the beach, El Raval, the historic immigrant quarter, Gracia, Marta's neighborhood. These were the districts with the most desirable locations for tourists, which made them simultaneously the most dangerous places for long-term residents to try to hold on. By 2019, Barcelona's city government, led by Mayor Ada Colau, who had herself been an anti-eviction activist before entering politics, had become one of the most aggressive regulators of short-term rentals in the world. The city froze new tourist apartment licenses in 2015. It launched inspection teams to root out unlicensed listings. It took Airbnb to court and won fines in the hundreds of thousands of euros for listings that violated local regulations. But even these measures, among the toughest on the continent, arrived after the displacement had already happened. Many of the residents who left between 2014 and 2017 never came back. Marta was one of them. She moved to a suburb 40 minutes from her school. The bakery woman no longer saves her the last croissant. There is no bakery where she lives now. This leads to the second part of this story, and it requires us to cross the Atlantic. Because what happened in Barcelona was not a European anomaly. It was a preview. Here is something I want you to think about before we go further. When a business model is legal, profitable, and convenient, at what point does a society decide the cost to communities is too high? Think about that, because the answer to that question is at the center of everything that happened next. Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously. Because what I am about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear. And it changes everything. New Orleans, Louisiana. The year is 2015. The city is still in the long process of recovering from Hurricane Katrina, which struck in August 2005 and destroyed or severely damaged more than 200,000 homes. The lower Ninth Ward, the Treme, Broadmoor, neighborhoods that were predominantly black and working class, had not fully rebuilt a decade after the storm. Meanwhile, the French Quarter in Marigny and Bywater, the historic, touristic, culturally rich neighborhoods closer to the river, had recovered more quickly and were now being aggressively listed on Airbnb. A research team from the University of New Orleans studied the short-term rental market between 2015 and 2019. What they found was deeply troubling. In the neighborhoods most affected by Airbnb proliferation, between 20 and 30% of housing units had been converted to short-term use. This was not spare rooms being rented out occasionally by local homeowners supplementing their income, which is the original premise Airbnb was founded on when Brian Chesky and Joe Gebbia launched it in 2008. This was entire apartment buildings and multiple unit properties being operated by professional landlords or investment companies, sometimes managing dozens or hundreds of listings simultaneously. In New Orleans, as in Barcelona, the typical Airbnb host was not a local family with an extra room. Increasingly, it was a commercial operator with a portfolio. The impact on black residents was particularly severe. A study published in the Journal of Urban Economics in 2021 found that increases in Airbnb listings in New Orleans were associated with rent increases that disproportionately affected low-income and minority households, precisely the households that Katrina had already displaced once. The same communities that had been promised a chance to rebuild were being slowly priced out a second time, not by a hurricane, by an algorithm, by the invisible hand of a global platform optimizing for tourist dollars per square foot. By 2019, New Orleans had enacted some of the strictest regulations. Owner occupancy requirements, meaning you had to actually live in the property to list it, were introduced in many residential zones. Enforcement was inconsistent. Fines were levied. Licenses were revoked. But the same pattern as Barcelona held. The regulations came after the damage. The people who had been pushed out were largely gone. Now here is where it gets interesting. Because while Barcelona and New Orleans are well documented, the most dramatic and least covered case of this pattern may be the one that unfolded in Lisbon, Portugal, between 2013 and 2019. And it involves not just displacement, but a deliberate government policy that made the situation dramatically worse. Lisbon in 2013 was an austerity-wounded city. Portugal was in the grip of a severe economic crisis. Unemployment had reached 17%, the government had accepted a bailout from the International Monetary Fund and the European Union, and property prices had collapsed. The government, desperate for revenue and foreign investment, introduced a set of policies that combined to create a perfect storm of displacement. The first was the non-habitual resident tax regime, a program offering very low flat tax rates to foreign retirees and wealthy professionals who chose to move to Portugal. The second was the Golden Visa program, which offered residency rights to non-EU nationals who purchased Portuguese real estate above certain value thresholds. These policies, combined with Airbnb's explosive growth in Lisbon starting around 2014, created a triple pressure on the housing market. Foreign buyers were purchasing apartments for residency visas, foreign retirees were moving in for tax advantages, and thousands of properties were being converted. A study by the Lisbon city government published in 2018 found that in the historic neighborhoods of Alfama, Moraria, and Bairro Alto, tight-knit, centuries-old working communities built on steep hillsides, rental prices had increased by more than 60% in 5 years. 60%. Not over a generation. Over 5 years. The residents of these neighborhoods were among the oldest in the city. Many were elderly, on fixed pensions, living in apartments their families had occupied for 2 or 3 generations. The buildings themselves were often in protected historic zones, which meant landlords could not easily demolish them. But they could evict tenants under Portugal's outdated tenancy laws, which allowed evictions for renovation. Evictions for renovation, locally called despejo para obras, became so common they had their own name and their own protest movement. The rot was in the beams, not on the surface, and the beams had been rotting for years before anyone looked up. By 2019, Portugal had restricted the Golden Visa program in Lisbon and Porto, capped the number of new Airbnb licenses in certain districts, and introduced stronger tenant protections. But again, the people displaced between 2014 and 2019 had mostly already moved to peripheral suburbs or left the cities entirely. An estimated 50,000 people left Lisbon's historical center in that period, according to city census data. In a city of roughly 500,000 people, that is a staggering number, an entire community, gone. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people assume housing crises happen because of corruption or bad luck. But you now know the mechanism. You know the hidden drain. You know how a platform that started as 2 guys renting out air mattresses in their San Francisco apartment in 2008 became, within a decade, a force capable of reshaping entire neighborhoods in cities 10,000 kilometers apart. You know that regulations exist and that they sometimes work, but that they almost always arrive late. If you are still here, you are not most people. Hit subscribe. Because the next section is the part this channel was made for, the part they never put in textbooks. Now observe what all of these cases have in common. Barcelona, New Orleans, Lisbon, 3 different countries, 3 different languages, 3 different political systems, 3 different levels of wealth. But the same mechanism, operating at the same speed, producing the same outcome. In each case, the platform connected local real estate to a global pool of tourism demand that was vastly larger and wealthier than the local residential market. A tourist from London or New York or Shanghai can afford to pay a nightly rate that, on a monthly basis, is 3, 4, sometimes 5 times what a local resident earns in rent. Landlords are not villains in this story. They are rational actors responding to price signals. If renting your apartment to tourists generates 4,000 euros a month and renting to a local family generates 800 euros, the economic logic is not complicated. The market is doing exactly what markets do, optimizing for the highest return. The problem is that housing is not a normal market. It is not like buying a television or choosing a restaurant. Housing is infrastructure. It is the foundation on which people build their entire lives, their jobs, their schools, their social networks, their sense of identity. When you price someone out of housing, you do not just move them to a different product. You dismantle the entire architecture of their existence. In Barcelona, studies showed that residents displaced from central neighborhoods to suburban peripheries experienced significantly higher rates of social isolation, longer commute times averaging an additional 40 minutes per day, and reduced access to the social support networks that urban communities generate naturally. In Lisbon, elderly residents evicted from Alfama showed measurable increases in depression and anxiety according to social services reports from 2018 and 2019. In New Orleans, the second displacement of communities already traumatized by Katrina created what social researchers described as a compounding grief. The loss of a home, not once, but twice, by forces that felt equally unstoppable and equally indifferent to human cost. The mechanism, at its core, is a tournament. Local housing markets are essentially local competitions, where local wages compete with local rents. For generations, this system worked imperfectly but functionally. Wages and rents existed in rough proportion to each other because both were anchored to the same local economy. Airbnb broke that anchor. It introduced a global competitor into a local tournament. And local residents, competing with the spending power of global tourism, almost always lose. At this point, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. But it also raises the most important question of this entire video. Who wins? And this is where history gets uncomfortable. Because the winners in this pattern are not random. They are consistent, and understanding who they are is the only way to understand what might have been done differently. The winners are those who owned property before the platform arrived. In Barcelona, landlords who held apartment buildings in Gracia or Barceloneta in 2013 saw the value of those properties increase by an estimated 40 to 60% by 2019. In Lisbon, property owners in the historic center who held on and converted to tourist rentals often tripled or quadrupled their annual income. In New Orleans, property investors, many of them not from New Orleans, who purchased distressed properties generated returns described as extraordinary. Some properties generating returns of 15 to 25% annually on purchase price, figures that in normal residential markets would be considered impossible. The losers are those who rented, full stop. Renters, who in many European cities make up 40, 50, even 60% of the urban population, had no equity stake. They received none of the gains. They absorbed all of the costs. When rents rose, they either paid more or they left. When landlords converted buildings, renters had no right to participate in the economics of that decision. They were simply on the wrong side of an asset class.